Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to get started today with our live briefing, Economic Statecraft and Public-Private Coordination, brought to you by the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. My name is Madeline Field, and I'm an assistant editor at War on the Rocks, where I work on our Cogs of War section, which focuses on defense tech and industrial policy. So this is the eighth in our live briefing series, assessing the economic statecraft problem set as a core national security domain. And these webinars are based on our ongoing 11-part article series in War on the Rocks entitled War by Other Ledgers. So today we'll be discussing shared strategic and operational risks between the US government and the private sector and how best to align public-private partnerships. So I'm thrilled to be joined today by General Tim Ray, a retired Air Force four-star general and CEO and president of Business Executives for National Security, or BENS, and Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow at the Potomac Institute. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
So to our audience, General Ray and Tim will be doing a live Q&A at the end of the session, so put your questions in the chat if you have them. This will later be uploaded on YouTube as well, so you can share it. But I do want to jump right into the article. And General Ray, starting with you, before we talk about the article, actually, I would like to talk about your introduction. And you kind of say that when you had joined BENS, you thought, there was a big difference between what you thought your job would be and then what it ended up being. So if you could provide us with a little more detail about that and how it led to the article, to kick it off.
Yeah, great question. There was some pretty crisp things that they wanted me to accomplish here at the organization. And, it was really about finding the right place to be. We were trying to be a lot of things to a lot of people, so there needed to be a refinement. And once you started doing that work, you realized that there's a lot of great things this organization could be doing. But when you watch the experts at play, what they brought to the table. I've been humbled by teammates in the military in terms of their talent. I've had some great teammates on the Hill. I didn't quite know how to anticipate the non-defense prime business world. But as I watched, I could see that everybody had a role to play, but not everybody appreciated the complementary pieces. And I just read the book Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman. And I talked to him about, that whole theme of the book. And I said, you wrote about three tensions. And he goes, I didn't write about three tensions. But hear me out. You wrote about the labor management tension. You wrote about the political economic tension between DC and New York about the economy, but you wrote a lot about the tension between Congress, the military, and industry. And I think the lesson that was really important out of that book to me was that in that instance in World War II, we got the tensions right. Right. So everybody played their role and it complemented and it mandated yield. And so I come into this thinking, yeah, we can bring a lot more to the government. But then as I watched the economic forum at the Reagan Institute, I realized a big part of my job is now to mobilize the business community. And we talk about a national security industrial base. When you talk to people in the investment world, you say, hey, I want you in national security. They kind of park on this defense industrial base. And then the reality is the defense industrial base can't be as big or as good as it needs to be unless there's this dual use manufacturing base, which we by habit innovate and then we outsource this production and there's a lot of losses. And then there's an infrastructure piece. And so until you master these other two, reform inside the div, it doesn't matter because, and so now I saw the role of us as saying, hey, look, there's a lot more we can all do. There's a lot of great, phenomenal talent. It's just not on the same page, right? And if you want economic statecraft, it's got to be something where all the strengths are blended and the weaknesses are overcome. And so when I wake up every day, it's how do I build a better team without being, the person saying, you got to do this, you got to do that, or hey, this is what policy needs to be. You get the relationships to happen and the people to work together. So that's how I view my work every day.
It's been such a theme throughout the series that we've explored, Tim. Just the amount of coordination, as you said, that needs to happen. How are you guys viewing that at the Potomac Institute?
Well, Thank you, first of all, for doing this, Maddie. Thank you, General Ray, for doing this and for the article. So I appreciate your time and what you're doing and what the mission of Ben's is, and especially your service in uniform prior to that. And yes, it does, I think, come down to relationships, but I think it really, a lot of this comes down to education and what Ben's is doing to bring together or people together in the private sector and the public sector to educate, what either side is doing and provide a path to move forward. And that's really what I think I got out of this article, hands down. And it really demonstrates again something that our research has definitely shown is that hey, the private sector's in the driver's seat for this, and so they need help. Um, First of all, understanding that some of there's a spectrum there of how much they understand that, right? And so what General Ray, I think, is doing and his colleagues is incredibly valuable in making sure that, again, both sides are educated and that there's a deliberate path forward to make sure that that economic statecraft can be a lever, right? And is a lever that we can use to pursue national objectives in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah, let me add to that. I mean, Tim, you guys have been tremendous teammates here too. I mean, so it's not just Ben. We have the benefit of working alongside you and your team and to have some of these conversations. We've hosted several events, but I think this ability as a community to really refine this thinking about not just having economic statecraft, but what does it mean and how do you implement it? That's team sport. So, Ben's has got a lot of experts, but we got a lot of smart people out there too, and you guys are absolutely part of that mix.
Well, I think this is a perfect segue into your article. And you identified three overarching themes, that companies need to start redefining corporate risk, the three-party alignment problem, as you call it, that you referred to in your introductory remarks, and then resilience as deterrence. So I'd love to start with the first theme. So in that first theme, identify then four categories of risk, which are input dependency, market access as leverage, infrastructure concentration, and then time horizon. And you say that boards need to incorporate this into their basic definitions of what fiduciary responsibility is. So, first of all, in a very ideal world, what does it look like when a company starts to take this more seriously?
Let me kind of step up and then go right back to that point. You said fiduciary responsibility, and that becomes a little bit of the challenge because there's equal concern on all camps. Congress's fiduciary responsibility plays in an interesting way. It essentially the corporate board for the military. At times, it can be a local, regional, state, fiduciary responsibility. There's the broader set of capabilities, and so how well they execute those. The American military's fiduciary responsibilities to the Constitution and to American moms and dads for American sons and daughters and to prevail, so those are important fiduciary responsibilities. I think, you're always going to have to let that play, but there has to be some adjustments, right? There has to be some tweaks to how people view it. When I come into the corporate board's perspective, we shouldn't be naive. I mean, without a common picture of strategic threat and strategic risk, and that, we talk about how you can measure that. Time horizon is a big piece of it. You know, they will have the challenge of selling to their shareholders the way forward based on that particular piece. And it's not some easy thing. And by sector, it changes, as you know. If you're in the bank or insurance world, that's easy street. But if you're in a tech company or if you're in a commodities production, until you start running into some of these barriers, it's hard to translate that. So what I think you see, they're becoming different ideas about, do we spin things off? Do we set a different corporate structure? Do we find a way to restructure our supply chain? Do we spend the money in the M&A side or do those things that de-risk the long term? But you'd have to say that they had a picture of the strategic risk and what it meant. We've had several folks from around the Intel community. Some would share with us, there are companies that were very clearly just going to ride it out and burn it down out of China because there's no way out to do it. It's kind of the innovator's dilemma. Do I preserve or start new? And sometimes they have to go start new and let the old one burn, which is a very real concern. And that's something I don't think everybody understands. But when corporate boards began to really factor it in, they change their approach to things. They change their business model, and they change the conversation with their shareholders. They change that relationship.
So there's a lot I'd love to unpack there, starting with kind of what sectors you mentioned that, insurance banks have already started to price this in, have started to readjust. What sectors are you particularly concerned about?
I'm particularly concerned about dual use technology manufacturing. We are the most innovative country on the planet. We prototype it and we send it away to get built. And so we don't get the multiple as a country. We don't get the workforce. We don't get the supply chain ownership. We don't get the role in the global market, which gives us some more traction. We don't have the infrastructure that matches it. We don't have the permitting policy that would create speed in this space. And so, we've got to have a lot more, not just dual use technology manufacturing, but when you're looking at this as a military leader, you want to know that the machine that is at work behind you has the ability to build anything, right? You can look at certain critical minerals or certain key pieces that are elemental. We may have the mineral or the resource, but until we process it into something that does help the entire industrial base, till there's actually the reassurance that that's not a single point of failure and wavering. So there's a sense that you can bring those in. I think when we talk to family offices and investors, we talk to them about the national security industrial base, and they're all intimidated, not all, but most, by the defense tech. But then when you start to explain these other pieces, they begin to see local solutions and they will begin to work those issues. But there has to be a sense that regional local manufacturing of dual use technology is a greater and greater reality.
And you talk about some of the squeeze, especially in industries that are operating in China. What are some warning signs that perhaps people, who are in businesses watching this should keep their eyes peeled for?
Well, I could tell you it's more the case that they know exactly what they're up against, but they're in that challenge, that trilemma of, do I stay, do I reset, or do I just kind of gradually work my way out of it? I think that's the prevailing sense, is that they're all pretty savvy, but it's hard. And I make the little quip in the article. It's harder to get a major acquisition system through in the Pentagon and Congress, or getting a company out of China. I think it's a coin toss. And I will tell you, the feedback from the business community is, thank you for saying that, because it's actually really, really hard. It becomes a question of sector, it becomes incentives, it becomes, where can they land back in the United States? Can they find the workforce? I mean, our workforce is going to govern a ton of this.
So do you have a sense in the interactions you have with the business community that they know, I guess, who to approach, where to go in the government when they're seeing threats or risks that they should be concerned about from a security standpoint, that have broader implications, not just with their entity? Are they able to do that? Are you having that conversation at all? Are they asking that?
I think when you think about, this administration's ability to pick up the phone and say, come see me, there's that top tier of industry, the bigs, and we're talking oil, we're talking energy, we're talking manufacturing, we're talking airlines. If it's a big name, it's getting time with this administration, right? So that's not what I worry about. What I worry about is that that band below them that everything rides on, right?
Sure.
So I was talking with one of the, I won't go with service, but talking to one of their sustainment officers, the head for sustainment, said he noticed that there's this silver tsunami, right? So we noticed a silver tsunami, where that's that last generation of a company that is building that widget for the supply chain. And the family has chosen not to continue, but the company wasn't really built to be taken over There's a couple of instances where people have come in and done. There's actually one instance where a company is coming in and buying those and tripling the price.
Hmm.
Right. So I got $10 says that there's some pretty adversary capital inside that stack
Sure.
because it's not just the tech, it's the capital at play, and it can play in some pretty surreptitious methods. And so that was my recommendation is go unpack the investors of that company. I think you may not find. And as it turns out, certain things have to pass a foreign investment test. That actually doesn't. So it's that other crowd in there that's pulling in capital to move forward, but not quite so savvy as to who's pulling the strings.
So when it comes to that problem of information sharing, as you were saying, the primes can call up the administration and get information when they need it. What can the government do to better serve or accommodate that middle tier that's just as critical to national security, but less large and or politically active?
Um, I think it's a two-way street of who's calling who. I think that that this is a different environment altogether. I think what Secretary Feinberg is doing to create a very different picture for, how we're engaged is very helpful in many ways. I think, you look at where Secretary Duffy's team is going with a public-private partnership playbook, and we're collaborating with them, in terms of that dialogue. It becomes the ability to convene. And one of the things we're going to try to pull together is a more robust family office engagement construct because and if you don't understand the family office network, if you met one family office, you've met one family office. I mean, they're all very different, but they're a very interesting financial athlete and depends on the generation or the scope or the DNA of them. They have some tremendous capability to do some stuff. We want them to be more active because they can play inside that space in very helpful ways. They can take things off the table for, more hostile people quickly, right? So can we get them to be part of this capital markets campaign where the capital is playing in an active way? It's going to be very hard for that big of a community to talk to the government and the government to talk to them. I mean, that is brutally tough. I think you have success at the state level. I think where states can then, curate federal, local, state, incentives or taxes or permitting issues, you can create a different set of conversations with that smaller crowd. I do think that this is a national problem with a lot of state and regional solutions. And so I think you have to kind of move yourself down one level in government and begin those kinds of engagements. And that's been very successful for us in Massachusetts.
Are there any prior, I guess, similar policy circumstances that can provide a good roadmap for businesses as they deal with more economic statecraft issues? We just ran a webinar with Dr. Jason Blessing, and it was on cyber and how cyber is both involved in economic statecraft and provides a roadmap for where it needs to go. So do you have a sense of anything that would be a useful corollary for some of these,
I
businesses?
I think where folks are going with the industrial policy from, basically the acquisition sustainment Secretary Duffy is a great place to start. What's missing is this really crisply coherent interagency piece that blends the state, the treasury, the commerce, because it's not just domestic, it's foreign as well, right? Because it's such an integrated system. And let's face it, our system wasn't built to be that. I mean, there's no playbook for 2026. I mean, none. And so we're not doing too bad. We could be a lot better than we are, but the ideal state is that there's a far more integrated relationship between DOE, DOW, state, treasury, commerce, and that is a wicked hard problem to get the synergy. To go to a single place, I think is going to be pretty tough. I think you're going to have to read and ask a lot of questions because, and if you're in this administration, you're pounding so hard on a problem. What we're noticing is that they are telling a story, but they're not spending the extra calories to propagate. I think they have the tailwinds inside the hill, and the money has been good. The question is, how can we make it really good? And that's the part that's really tough to pull off if you're trying to shift so much and then communicate it. Big lift. And, that's no administration has had that figured out.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so no, and you just reinforce something that we've come across over and over again, sir, and that's the overarching strategy and doctrine to go along with approaching this from the public and private side. We're still working through that and what it looks like and who the champions are, right, and who the referee is. And that's actually previews an article we have coming down the pike by some of our other contributors that is hoping to actually address some of that with some of the broader work that they're doing. Thankfully, we've been talking about this long enough and working toward solutions long enough now where we're actually starting to see, as you mentioned, sir, some traction in the right places. And hopefully that translates and has been translating, I think, to action, which is where we need to go. But it's us in a federation, right? In a federated society trying to make it work in a way that is congruent with our values still, right? With free and open markets, with transparency and open government and such. And that's a lot of work.
And I think if you play this for a while, then you realize the old tools had utility, but not enough. And you almost
Right.
had to have a couple of things that worked that didn't, the government taking an equity stake and at Prime there's a lot of merit to those as long as you have the offtake and you know how that's going to play. Other parts of the government do it. The CHIPS Act was the very same thing. So you almost have to prove a different set of tools can work before the policy world embraces them. You can have a new authority, but does the bureaucracy embrace it as a practice? And you can change legislation, but it doesn't mean you change the culture. And so there has to be a little bit of a running with scissors for a bit for you guys. So, it actually worked. Um, and there's people who have an idea what will work and won't work. And guess what? There's no playbook for this. So we're going to have to go think it through differently.
Right. And you have to have a leader or leaders, right, that are willing to take that risk, which, which isn't it's not easy, and it depends on what sector you're talking about and all the other risks that they're dealing with to the earlier points.
Well, I'd love to continue talking about some of the risks that you identified in your article, because I think they're hard to talk about, and we'd love to get your thoughts on them. So the first is input dependency. So how does kind of your description of this input dependency problem go beyond or further than a normal risk calculus that a business may take? And what should companies do once they've identified such a vulnerability?
I think once they've identified the vulnerability, they actually need to keep digging because it's probably not the only vulnerability. I think the trust we had in the globalized system was pretty deep. And there's a lot of good reasons to have that trust, right? So there's just a picture that, hey, it was going to show up. I mean, I remember walking through the grocery store going, apples show up every month out of the year, and I know apples don't grow every month out of the year. So how do I get that same apple 12 months out of the year? And so somehow or another, somebody's sending me an apple from another place because it's not America. I mean, that's a simple task, but we talked a little bit about an adverse capital stack and how that could be against you. But to think through those second and third, when you trusted it. If you go to the first thing is your problem, you haven't built trust. You maybe have alleviated a short-term thing, but you actually need to keep digging and to build in the resiliency. And then I think the good companies will be the ones that have the yes, if, not no, because. Yeah, we can do this if these things are different or these things change. Here's just one example. In the defense primes, many of them are capped at 10%, so no one's going to innovate. All right, so we could probably build that missile 10 different ways until someone is less risk averse in the capital to mature something with a different methodology or a different look from the very beginning to say, hey, look, we can use a different technology. You're actually kind of in an innovator's dilemma. Either you rethink the product entirely or you make it good enough because you can't get the thing you needed. There has to be a lot of that innovator's dilemma. They have to think through how they'll do it. And they could be going back to the, we'll run it as long as we can until we can't get it. I think um, tungsten's a big problem right now. I think the price just went through the roof. We're going to find more and more of those things, but it's a pretty good compound to put into things until you can innovate and create something that's not as dependent on it. You're kind of stuck, or you create your own sources, and that doesn't happen overnight. So there's a trust factor. Keep digging and keep innovating. But I think it's fair to say that the investment community is far less risk averse than it used to be. That's a good sign. But I think it becomes, how do you rebuild from the beginning, or how do you reroute it? Look at what's going to happen in the Middle East from an oil standpoint. And we in America went through, and we're joking, and Tim, you're probably not old enough to be sitting in the back seat of the mom's station wagon in the gas lines in the 70s, right? Like I did. And we're more efficient with cars. We're now more energy independent. We're going to feel this less than any other country. These kinds of shocks rewire, but it takes time. And you're going to find pipelines are going to pop up in other places. You're going to find different relationships. And I think that's the kind of thing that people are going to figure out a better way, but it won't be quick.
I think this is getting to really, I think, the heart of the article, which is how do you sell the prospect of these, short-term losses, especially if a company is having financial, issues from a shock. So do you find that it's actually easier, I guess, now with the Iran war to tell companies, the sort of risks that they face if they continue to keep their supply chains coupled with adversary nations? How are you selling that, I guess, to boards?
Um, so we won't sell it to boards directly. We will talk about it. We'll talk with rooms of investors. And I do spend time with the banks and the insurance ecosystem, a little bit in the real estate developer construction world. And they've got those things figured in there pretty well. What I think you're going to see is as they go through this, it's pretty clear that the whole system is really tightly integrated, and it's going to take a lot. Um, I mean, how best to navigate that? I'm not going to be one to preach to a board. Business is hard. For anybody in uniform, you think business is easy? Man, it's a brutal world. And so, I have a deep respect for those who've been successful at it, and I've seen ones who are average. This is no mean feat. And so it's not a preachy place I'm coming from. It's just to help them understand the contours of their risk. And then, some of them are better at others at talking to their shareholders and making those moves. But it all depends on the sector. It all depends on, on the market.
You just hit on something I think that's really important, sir, and I'd love your thoughts on this too, because it does really hit on the intersection of the public-private partnerships that exist and the ones that we need to make, and that is when you are engaging with senior folks in uniform. How are you helping them navigate this too? Because I know in my experience in service and probably yours too, and I'm not obviously not going to speak for you, but that there was very limited exposure to what you're dealing with, right, at Ben's. So how do we rectify that, and what are you, I guess, what are you doing in your engagements to help move that along? Because that's such a important part of us succeeding together moving forward.
Yeah, it has played out, Tim, in volumes. And so when you find a chance to meet with very senior military leaders and you can get the wall to come down, it's like, hey, I get it. I have no idea how to do that. Right. And we didn't train them to.
Right.
We didn't train them to, we have a generation of people who grew up in the war on terror, the post-Cold War. We weren't in a system of system versus system. We had unit versus unit, platform versus platform. Now it is system versus system, and the foundations of the military are anchored in the 80s, the infrastructure, the tech. And so you get this monumental multi-generational leap. There's tools out there, but no one's lived this. So in their defense, a couple of the services, and I won't say which ones, they've asked for direct help on certain parts of this, but when you look at their team, they don't know how to cut these deals. And so we at Benz are being brought into the room to say, these people are pretty good at it. They can look at your RFI, they can look at your RFP, they can look at the offtake game plan, they can think through how you're going to do this, and they could give you some advice. Hey, we've never done this kind of innovation before in terms of manufacturing. I can bring some people in to make you a more informed customer. So we're finding the pace of bringing our members into the room in a non-pitch, non-business development world, really going, hey, we ought to be able to do that. One of the recommendations we've had in a couple of instances is, hey, if you have a service secretary who's engaged, they can turn around and create their own brand of players in a reservist role. They can bring in experts from the outside sector, put them on orders as a reservist for 3 or 4 years and help them be part of the process and help them do that kind of thing. It's not a question of, do we want to do this? It really now is a question of, how do I do it? How do I get Congress on board? How do I get everybody in the Pentagon on board? How do I get, everybody to believe that this is the right way? And I think that there's a lot of opportunities, particularly as a nonprofit. That's a role we're going to play a lot more of.
So I think this is a perfect transition into the second theme, which is the three-party alignment problem. So, sir, you frame Congress, as you said, somewhat like a corporate board for the national security enterprise. So given the current policy environment, as you said, totally unprecedented, whether it's rates, tariffs, supply chain issues, how functional or possible is that idea right now? And what about in, 8 years from now?
Yeah, tough call. I mean, it's such a volatile time. As everybody's gone before us, have gone through tough times, didn't have a playbook, and so we're kind of writing that. Things I think you should take as positives. The fact that there is a reconciliation conversation even happening should be cup more than half full. The fact that they have changed legislation to permit all kinds of different funding methodologies, particularly for infrastructure, that they've changed legislation to allow different manufacturing construction techniques to say you don't actually have to use the Navy or the Army Corps. I think what you're seeing is a very bipartisan, centrist kind of changing of the environment. I don't care, I shouldn't say it that way. You could get a Democrat in the White House next time, and I don't think that stuff changes. I think everyone sees the glowing red light on the dashboard, and I think it is there's a great deal of centrist things happening here. How energy plays, the executive order is always a problem. But I think when people see that there's a way to do and lift more and more, when the Jamie Dimons of the world are saying, hey, I've got $1.5 trillion on the table for national security, then the business world's kind of starting to play a role. And I think that is very helpful. I think some people want very crisp guidance. I think they want the certainty. And there's a crowd of business people that's like, that's fine, I'll figure it out. But not all of them that way, and nor would I could profess to be that way if I was in business. But I think you're seeing good bipartisan support for OSC, the Office of Strategic Capital, Defense Innovation Unit. Some of those things are there. I think you're going to see a different environment with the primes regardless over the next 5 years, 5, 10 years. And I think you'll see more people recognizing a manufacturing profit opportunity in that dual use technology. I think it becomes small variations, even whoever comes next. I can't see the world events being what they are, letting somebody draw a radically different conclusion than where we are now.
So I think a topic of conversation in a couple of these webinars has been the proposed defense budget. How, I guess, likely do you think that $1.5 trillion will be sustained past whatever next administration comes? And I guess how concerned from a stability perspective are you about the prospect of, that budget being cut 40%?
You've got a national debt. I used to think one way about national debt, and what you have with that, you can pay your national debt. It's a margin slack issue as the business community. You lose opportunities to do other things. I'm not a big fan of it growing the debt because you do lose strategic flexibility. The business people worry about it, but they don't wring their hands as much. The ones who really get finance and what's happening. They probably get more of a concern about, how there's coherency in this. What's a better way to answer your question? The budget, I think you could come at it from the sense that there's a lot of things that need to be reset from the 80s. It gets to be a better budget when you can put, for every nickel you put on the table from the Pentagon, you get 3 more nickels from the private sector. And it makes money and it grows because that's good for the economy. I don't know how well we could do that. And it becomes a invest to divest. Do you have, so the B-21, for example, is a platform that can rapidly modify radios, weapons, sensors, right? So the core plane is very stable, but like the Ukrainians are doing this with drones, you'll be able to do more like that with the B-21, which is unheard of. And that's why the program's on. But you could bake in a different infrastructure and ecosystem that creates a more flexible, viable force. There's really not much margin when you're paying too much for weapons, when you don't have as much utility with the platforms that you did in the past, then you've got to find a way to get yourself to a more flexible place. I don't think that's a sustainable budget. I would not recommend you do that. I do think you have to have a short-term rebuild of the foundation so that you can provide a military capability that's far more flexible than it is now.
So, sir, something I've heard a theme, and whether or not it's deliberate or not, from our discussion so far is there's a lot of opportunity, and this is hopefully resonant with the business community. There's a lot of opportunity in the evolution that we're dealing with right now, also. And if the business community can wrap their heads around it, right, in a thoughtful way and approach. There are opportunities to be had to make sure that this evolution moves forward in the right way. Especially to your point in the article, right? If there's a common picture, right, that the public sector and private sector are able to see, and I think we talk about one of the most challenging things of how to get the private sector to move forward with the public sector, with the government on this is okay, well, how do we incentivize the private sector to do that? Like, what's the profit look like? Right? What should they chase after, and how does policy, adjust to make that happen? So, and that's the beauty, I think, of our innovative markets, right? And why I'm optimistic in that regard, but I see a theme here, sir. Moving forward with regard to opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, and you're going to see some policy shifts. I mean, I think OMB is thawing to the idea of multi-years, right? And so when you had a 10% cap on the primes, I mean, if you look at the profit margin of every prime, it's 10 plus or minus 2, right? So if you're doing cost plus contracts, or if you're doing those kinds of things, you won't bring in a cheaper thing. You won't spend the money to produce a cheaper version because there's no incentive. You're just going to make 10% of a smaller piece. You won't make your money back. And so until that environment thaws, until there's more affordable dual use capabilities on the table that are real, because the government shouldn't be the scaler of that, right? It can't be the scaler of everything. It's got to be the ones that actually can buy off of a very viable market. Then I think you start to see more affordable alternatives that are sustainable. There's a little bit more of the institutions at play here begin to kind of thaw the edges, right? So when OMB says, we'll live with a 7-year multi-year on that, particularly on weapons, that's a victory. And it's really hard to do to get that money up front to get that play. So we'll see how it goes. I think it'll continue.
So when I keep talking about some of those alternative institutions that you mentioned, I'd love to get your take on how you think state, commerce, treasury can play a role sort of in the next couple of years.
Well, you're living in a very interesting time. Geography matters again. Um, you've got a lot of things in America, but you don't have all the things you need. You've got partners who are strategic partners, they're security partners, or they're economic partners. And it probably behooves us to spend some time thinking about partners on those three axes every time and making sure the ones who are high on each of those are still tightly in the fold. And what are the relationships and trade deals and the military relationships and the co-production pieces that's a little bit more of a realistic approach. I mean, if you had unlimited resources, you could do anything anywhere. But you really have to step back and go, where do we move the ball forward for the good of the team, right? I talk about the joint force inside the United States military. It can do some exquisite things and it needs to continue to do that, but it doesn't just do it for itself, it does it for partners and allies. Because we have to play a very special role with our teammates. And it's not an us versus them, it's a us and them and how we put that together, kind of the Michael Jordan of the team. And yes, I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan because of the way he played the game. He knew he was the most gifted guy on the court, but he got everybody in the game. And then if he won, they won, the team won. If he lost, he lost. And I think that you have to start thinking about partners and allies in that way. And so there's a way to stitch treasury, commerce, state back into that. And so when we go abroad, when we go abroad twice a year, I want more and more commerce teammates, more and more treasury teammates, more and more State Department teammates, because we go a lot of times for the military and all we do is validate their suffering. We don't give them any real policy solutions that live outside of state, treasury, or commerce. And so I think as they think about our priorities and they think about the country and the national security strategy, there's a way to build up and use your capacity to go out versus trying to cut from the out and bring it to the middle.
So I'd love to keep actually talking about partners and allies. We ran an article at Warren Rocks, I think last week, about how the United States and Canada could reindustrialize together. But there are very clear, I think, political consequences right now for the Canadian government to pursue a relationship with the United States that would mean more cooperation rather than less. So how are you guys viewing that? There have been some countries that have been very successful with this administration. I think Korea's done pretty well, Japan's doing well. But how are you thinking and how are you speaking to other allies?
I'm thinking long term, and I was the deputy commander in Europe for 2 years, and um, I think you have to appreciate that there are multiple layers to every relationship. There's an academic relationship, there's a scientific, there's a business, there's a military, there's a diplomatic, and there's a political layer. And so you gotta find a way to start working your way in the areas where there is common ground to preserve relationships over the long haul because things change. Um, you've got a lot of challenges now as the world resets from globalization, as the liberal optimism fades of the system. It's not a graceful thing. And so how you build that. We were supposed to go to Germany to look at German rearmament. We're having to work a few more calories in there to create the honest broker narrative. And so we'll get there and we'll have a great conversation. But you're going to have to wade through a little bit of the turmoil and convince everybody, no, look, the business world can approach this apolitically. The scientific world can, and the academic world, they can be apolitical. Let's highlight the strengths in there. Let's keep those solid. And then as conditions present themselves, you reset it. But everybody's got to reset. And so how that is going to happen is very uneven in how people read the world. I think President Trump is an abject realist. Sphere of influence and that whole Putin is a realist. Xi is a realist. The survival of the state, etc. But no matter what you do as America, you actually have to go through a realist phase. If you believe in liberalism or if you believe in neoconservatism, you don't have the capacity to go be any of those two right now. You actually need to come home and reset that particular machine so that there's margin and capacity because you're far too vulnerable. It's like when the flight attendant says the mask drops, the flight puts yours on first before you can help anybody else. I think we actually need to live that a little bit here so that we can become a better version. And I think that's how you engage is, hey, look, there's long-term relationships to be established. There's things that need to happen over the long haul. Perhaps there's some political headwinds, but we know who our real friends and allies are.
I want to keep actually getting to this. I think you're right. Have been some very strong political headwinds. So what, I guess, steps in the near term do you think can be done to, provide support or repair some of the relationships that have been particularly damaged over the last year and a half or so?
Yeah, I'm not the guy to really talk to that piece with any specificity, but what I can say is there are things that can be done between countries and teammates in ways that are beneficial. But you have to start the conversation with, what are we going to do domestically to get better? And if you can't come up with those answers, then you actually have a logical set of conclusions. Um, Kind of a strange little vignette, but I was talking to somebody from the scientific community, an elite research institute. And the complaint was that science had been eviscerated, right? So there's certain institutions that kind of lost its way. USAID's lost its way. Everybody on both sides of the aisle, administration to administration, would tell you they needed reform. They all agree. But I'm talking to the scientists, and we'll just say if you're really good, you're a 10x institution. If you're so, you're a 1x institution. And the message from this individual is we need to fix science. And so my reply back to him is like, well, you're a 10x institution. Are you willing to say that every institution in the scientific community needs the same government support, or should a 10x and a 5x institution be taken care of because of their connection to national security, or is this general funding approach? And that's when it became pretty obvious is that we're just running the system, we're pushing money into the system, and we weren't being thoughtful about where each of these investments lie. And so the question to him was, are you going back and now and asking for a waiver because of your role and connection? And it got pretty awkward because you realize, no, we're letting the generalities play because some of the institutions really fractured. There's a lot of great things out there. There's a lot of great institutions. There's a lot of great partners and allies. Let's go find the good, strong stories and knit those together and make sure those get stronger. But I think if you can't start with your own shortfalls domestically, you can't see where those crisper, sharper narratives are.
I think this gets to your third theme, which is the idea that, resilience is deterrence. Um, so how far do you think we are from being able to realistically project the type of deterrence that you describe in your article, which is that a strong America is less likely to be interfered with economically?
Well, you're getting interfered with economically now. I mean, you look at tungsten, you look at critical minerals, it's happening, right? Your ability to ride out the oil issues in the Middle East is pretty unique as a country. It's being felt elsewhere. So the effects are there wherever you divine the intent or the motive behind it, it's happening. We're not immune from any of this. I think there's a couple of key thoughts. I think you have to understand the vulnerabilities from a way of life standpoint and embrace the threat and what it could mean. I'm very concerned about an infrastructure standpoint and its resilience. If you think about what it takes to take a punch and have margin or slack in the system and keep going, that I think is really important because we as America haven't done that before. I talked about, in the war on terror was unit versus unit, et cetera. Now it's system versus system, and it's all on the table. My current conflict in Iran has proven to us that that's more like a conflict with China, where we're fighting from a contested environment, right? We're doing things in space where we're being attacked in space, but with terrestrial targets. Our infrastructure, the oil infrastructure and energy and data infrastructure were attacked. And so at the end of the day, you've got to think through the resilience of sources and of the infrastructure? Is it a single point failure? I think until you've got the mental model of what that means and really deploy the resources of America to go do that, you're going to be in trouble. Energy has to become abundant, not just available or green. It's got to be abundant and assured. Not energy dominance, but energy abundance. You've got to be able to think about, uh, your system operating under conflict. And when we start thinking about where the Chinese are, I mean, let's be honest. I think the targets in Iran that Iran shot at were helped by Chinese space, and so nothing's going to hide. So how do we play against an adversary who has the means to impact us here kinetically and non-kinetically in the United States? And we have to start embracing that idea that we're feeling the economic tension, but there could be a physical piece if there's conflict in the Pacific with them.
So if you were king for a day, let's say, um, on what sort of timeline would you set this sort of resilience? 2035, 2040, 2050? Like what is, I guess, realistic if people were to start making policy choices, significant policy choices today?
I think you have to embrace the idea that you're never done. You're never done, right? So a long time ago, there's a village. They got attacked, they built a wall. And then the bad guys built a ladder and then the moat, and on we go. It's the enduring condition that you have to understand your vulnerabilities and always do what you can to retire them. Let's take quantum for a second. Let's say we solve the quantum problem before the Chinese do. We will probably play that as a country under one set of morals and values. My question is, can we close on the infrastructure across enough of the country in time to where that actually mattered? See what I'm saying? If you can't get quantum encryption in play, but for a small piece of the society, your society is going to fall apart. And yes, you won the fight for quantum, but you lost the war on quantum, right?
Are you worried about any, sorry to cut in, are you worried about any own goals here? Like, for example, we had Mythos come out a couple, weeks ago, or Mythos's capabilities were revealed a couple weeks ago, which will pose a lot of very significant national security concerns to many major corporations, infrastructure, as you said, schools.
I would say it's just Monday, Patty. I mean, I'm serious. This is the world we're in, that we had this incredible opportunity to enjoy sanctuary as a nation for so long. But the tech piece, right? People ask me what keeps me up at night. The debt bothers me. The fact that we have no civil discord bothers me. But it'll be the inability to close technologically, as such a society as we are, as technically oriented as we are. The bill to pay to catch up and close that gap across all of it is actually massive, right? And it's moving so fast when the biotech world and the space, the cyber and the quantum, it is a multifaceted infrastructure challenge. And so that's where I hope we can find smarter ways to build things. We can have the right workforce. We can have the right kind of infrastructure funding methodologies, but it's the capacity to close the gap at speed and pace that matters. It's speed and pace now more than just can I do it once.
Sir, one of the underlying themes or concepts that you outlined, articulated very well in the article was this, and I think we're getting at, and we've talked about a little bit here, but is helping the business community to see their role in more strategic light. Is that in your experience, is that resonating? I mean, because it goes at what we're talking about here, right? In order to be successful with that resilient infrastructure, we're going to have to be successful with that resonance of that concept. Is in your experience what you're seeing, is that happening? And if not, where do we need to get better to get there?
Yeah, it's kind of like, hey, Tim, you actually need to be healthier and be in better shape. You need to eat better. And these are the things that are wrong with you. And I say, I agree. I got to do that. Now, how do I do it? In the
Right.
world that I live in, it becomes the question. So I don't think it's really so much an issue that we got to do better. It becomes a question of, okay, what are the right next moves? Where do I actually get yield on that? So selling the idea isn't hard. When we talk to some of these investor conferences trying to get the message out on the strategic need for them to make money and work in the national security space, it's a process of talking to them about what is and what isn't. And, I go back to the Jamie Dimon story about $1.5 trillion over a decade for national security. A good chunk of what he's doing in that, he's just recategorizing for something he didn't call national security, that now is very much a national security investment. So you're actually doing a little bit better in national security than you think you are. You're just not going, that's national security. And so it is a question of, okay, you agree. Now let's talk about what that means. Let's talk about how we pull that together. And then there's well, I can't. Well, this is in the way, etc. Then you can say, well, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you cooperate at the state and local level? Can you talk to the governor? Can you talk to the mayor of this town? Can you create that investment? Can you bring teammates into this? Can you help in a public-private? Yeah, we could do that. And so it's just an awakening of those tools that are available to them. And I think it goes from old idea to actual implementation.
Well, General Tim, we are almost out of time with our webinar. So, Tim, I'm going to ask you first for some of your closing thoughts to our audience, just about how this fits into the problem set.
Yeah, no, thanks again, sir, for doing this, and for outlining what was really valuable contribution to this series of articles. And I hope that we can make sure that your thoughts are proliferated as we move forward and navigate trying to figure out the best way forward and make sure that both sides are educated on the government side and the public side. To me, something that you've I hit a few times here, which I'm encouraged to hear, and I think it's an opportunity that again that we're just starting to understand and see, and you're seeing it. It sounds like quite often is these layers, right, at the state and local business level. How do we leverage that? How do we make sure that that policymakers at the state and local level too are attuned to what's going on, and how can they work with their their businesses at the state and local level to get feedback and input into up to the national level. So policy is aligned throughout, which is again no easy task. And to your point, sir, earlier, I mean, it's geographically focused too. I mean, there's a lot of the Farm Bill just went through Congress, right? And the coalition for the Farm Bill, it's not necessarily about Republicans or Democrats. It's about where you live, right? And
Right.
what your business incentives are. So how do we get there in that regard? I think is something that you brought up that I think is something that we need to leverage and move forward on.
How about some of your closing thoughts, sir?
Well, first of all, let me just say thanks to the both of you and both of your organizations for being in this space. I mean, the series itself says a lot about War on the Rocks, and certainly, the teammate that we have with you guys with the Potomac Institute, Tim, is tremendous. I think it's going to take a lot of us rowing together, having the conversations and to kind of dispel some of the myths, because sound bites aren't helpful, right? And so where there's tangible stories and we're not going to get better all at once. We're going to get better one by one. And I just think it takes that diligence to go do that. So I appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you both again for this excellent webinar. Just so the audience knows, our next article, Mark Rosenblatt's article on advanced manufacturing and economic statecraft, will be out sometime soon. And then our next webinar will be with Dr. Jen Buss, who is the CEO of the Potomac Institute, and we will be talking about workforce education and economic statecraft. And that will be May 27th at 11 a.m. at the exact same channel. So thank you guys again. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you,
it.
sir. Great to see you, sir. Thank you so
Likewise.
much.